Welcome back to the channel. I wanted to talk a little bit about where we are and kind of give you an update on the Honda Trail 125 that I've been working on tuning for 164cc cylinder. Right now, the bike has about 360 miles on that new pistons in the old cylinder. It's doing pretty well. However, it is starting to consume a little bit of oil. And so I'm going to take it to the next step and trying to brainstorm some ideas on, are we still running too lean? Taking all that into account, I have some ideas, but first I wanted to talk to you about the build, what exact components I have currently on the motorcycle, and then what next steps I'm considering and why. This may get a little bit technical, but I'll kind of show you why I chose the original system that I did and where I went from there. The first row, called stock, actually tells the horsepower that the stock motor delivers at the rear wheel. And these were taken from Takagawa's website, and in fact all the configurations are based on Takagawa's numbers except for the 164cc numbers, which I interpolated. So while I was riding the stock motorcycle, it was capable of doing about 51 miles per hour, which is highlighted here in this column. And that was a little bit disappointing because everywhere I read on the net, they came up with 55 miles an hour. Well, I'm pretty sure that 55 mile an hour top speed is probably based on a full tuck position, which I don't think very many people want to ride the Honda Trail for very long. Column C here, 5,800 RPM or 45 miles per hour is what I saw whenever I went up a slight grade or with a headwind or a combination of both. And you can see why it dropped to 45, and that's because right here is the absolute highest horsepower that the stock motor in the stock configuration can produce, 7.4 horsepower. That kind of gave us the limits between 45 and 51 miles an hour where I ran this bike on the streets. And that is underpowered, in my opinion, for a 55 mile an hour speed limit, which again, around my area is the norm. The next thing I did is I plotted all of those different configurations that Takagawa had on their website for fourth gear, converting RPM into miles per hour. And I created a huge number of curves showing horsepower versus speed. Down here on the bottom is actually your stock motorcycle from about 42 miles per hour on up. And you can see that here's your highest horsepower right around 45 miles per hour. The next curve up is just if you added a Takagawa Sport exhaust, etc. on up. And you can kind of see there's a number of configurations that kind of slope up and then back down, and you have a number of configurations that slope up and stay up, okay? The difference between those two sets is one uses the stock airbox, the ones that kind of start up and then slope down, and then the ones that continue sloping up are the ones that use the Takagawa air filter pod. Then using a relatively, let's call crappy model, very quick and dirty model, I just used air resistance, ignoring, inherent friction from rolling resistance or spooling up the motor, oil circulating, things like that. So this was best case scenario. I basically looked at how your increase in velocity increases the need for horsepower, and then plotted that to determine exactly how much horsepower did I need in order to keep 55 miles per hour in those scenarios where the stock motor would hold 45 miles per hour. And that kind of became my basis of how much power do I need, and coming back over to the chart of speed versus horsepower versus configuration gave me an idea of where I needed to center. And what I found is probably the 143cc Air or the 143C with the stock. So when I say air, I mean with the air pod from Takagawa, or with the 143cc with the stock airbox, right? Was kind of where I thought it would allow me to get there. And in fact, the 143cc air actually did get me there. The 143cc with a stock airbox was somewhat lacking. So test number one is this 143cc Takagawa Hyper E stage kit with the added air filter kit. And this was one of the maps that Takagawa actually supplies with their Ficon Type E injection controller. You can see the part numbers that I used, and overall it was a really good system. I had no problems with it up to about 60, 62 miles per hour. It did very, very well. That air filter kit I did test with and without the air filter kit, and it gives you about 2 miles per hour, which is pretty nice. This was able to hold right around 55 miles per hour up those grades into headwind, maybe dropping down to 54 miles per hour at times. While as without the air filter kit, it would drop down to 51, 52 miles per hour. So great kit. However, I took it on the freeway, did a full tuck, got up to about 70 miles per hour. And when I got it back home, it had created heavy piston slap, which you see a video of. And there was also scraping on the piston skirt and piston lip. My theories at the time, after, again, consulting the boards, was that there was a design problem with that Takagawa piston, and several other people commented that they also had very, very similar results with that piston in creating piston slap. Some of them replaced it with Yamanashi 143cc pistons and cylinders and had good results. And so I kind of centered on that as the primary problem. After experiencing that failure, I wanted to move on from 143cc to 164cc, mostly because the 164cc piston and cylinder from Yamanashi was relatively inexpensive, almost the same price as 143cc. Yamanashi was recommended, so I went ahead and threw an 164cc kit. Again, my only thought was that, well, the Takagawa 143cc piston already had a design fault in it. And so I created a map for almost the exact same configuration as 143cc. I did that through interpolation, looking at 125cc to 143cc jump, and then push that to 164cc. But again, at 63 miles per hour on a country road, I had a catastrophic failure. And it started failing a lot earlier. You know, I'd be driving along and then suddenly it would power down. I'd back off on the throttle and it'd be okay. Well, that was what I believe was melting and cracking of the top of the piston along the edge. And ultimately, it consumed 100% of the oil. Now, I didn't know what happened first. Did the oil get consumed first, or did the piston get melted first? And my thought at the time, well, it was the first time I'd ever gapped a piston ring. I thought I might have made the gap too big, and I had consumed all the oil through the gap in the ring, and therefore, that was the most likely cause. My second thought was, maybe the fuel injection duty cycle was too high. And that brings us to our third test. So in this test, I got rid of the air filter pod. I used the stock air filter box. That should reduce the amount of needed fuel injection time. And again, I looked at the gap in the rings, and this time, instead of me modifying it, I just threw it in as is. And the end result was yet another Yamanashi 164cc failure. This time it was at about 60 miles per hour, same country road. I created a new map, this time interpolating between 143cc and 181 cc, which Takagawa had. And very similar result to test number 2. I had some piston slap after I ran it at relatively high speed for an extended duration, melted intake edge of the piston, and now my theory shifted almost entirely to the fuel injection duty cycle was too high. It's notable that without that air pod, I was reducing the fuel injection cycle considerably, but I thought I was still at the limit. The other theory that some people voiced in the comments was that there was insufficient lubrication here, which is test number 4. In this particular case, instead of replacing the cylinder and piston, I did just throw a piston in there. Could that have caused the latest issues? Maybe, but I'm doubtful after inspecting all the parts before assembling it. So in this test, the big addition here was the G1 fuel injector assembly from Takagawa. This is the recommended fuel injection assembly by that company. I also put the air filter pod kit back on it. And the reason I did that is because there is no fuel map for the G1 fuel injector that does not have that air filter kit on it. And therefore, I used that as my basis. I took a Takagawa 181cc map with the air filter and the G1 taken into account. I ran it on the highway and it ran really, really well. I took it back on the highway after about 350 miles. And the result was I'm starting to consume some oil, possibly some minor piston slap as well. And that's very disappointing because I thought, well, surely the fuel injector is the solution. And it helped a lot. We're talking 350 to 400 miles on this piston and cylinder. It's still operational, it still runs. It's consuming a high level of oil as far as I'm concerned, but we didn't have the catastrophic failures of test number 2 or test number 3. And so I do believe that G1 fuel injector has helped significantly in keeping everything cooler. And therefore, the longevity of that piston cylinder combination has increased significantly. However, we still want a bike that is absolutely bulletproof. I don't want to be riding this on a nice trip and have it fail halfway through that because of insufficient planning and design on my part. So what's going on here? First theory, insufficient lubrication cooling. So I'm using the stock oil pump, and they make high flow oil pumps, and I actually have bought one. It will be in the mail. And so perhaps by increasing the amount of oil being pumped through, it'll decrease the temperature. The second thought that I have is that the fuel mapping is insufficient at certain RPMs. Now, again, I'm using 181cc map on 164cc piston and cylinder. That can be problems. There are dips in the amount of fuel based on the characteristic of that other engine capacity. I don't know if that's my problem. It could also be that I was using a used cylinder, a new piston. And the other thing that I've started thinking about is maybe these piston speeds are too high for the Yamanashi piston cylinder design. Now this seems odd, but again, this is an air-cooled motor, and the piston velocities are actually pretty high. The actual stroke of this engine is pretty big compared to a lot of the engines that are made these days for other bikes. So keeping that into account, I may be generating a huge amount of friction through that high mean piston speeds. And it really comes down to what to do next. The Ficon Takagawa fuel injector controller has problems, and that is it doesn't look at the O2 values at all. I didn't realize that when I bought it, and therefore I thought, Well, I'll just do an 181cc air configuration. I'll make my bike into 164cc air configuration. And the fuel controller will adjust because it'll see the O2 not being where it's supposed to be, and it'll adjust like the stock bike is supposed to do, right? So the stock bike is supposed to be able to do that. The fuel controller doesn't. It actually has an O2 block. And so I don't think it's reading the O2 values at all. And therefore, it doesn't adjust when you put a new configuration on, or you're slightly off. This is really problematic because let's say the temperature increases or decreases, or your fuel, let's say you use 93 grade and now you're down to 91 grade fuel. What does that do as far as the configuration of the bike? The bike is not going to learn anything. And so what does that mean for me as the operator? That means I have to overly set the richness of the fuel injection because I've got to safeguard against those unusual events or different events that are occurring. And I really don't want to do that because even, with the 181cc configuration, I was down around 70 miles per gallon. And that's because I'm overly rich. I know I'm overly rich. And that's not exactly where I want to do. What I'd really like is use an auto tuner like, normal people. Or as opposed to that, give it to a professional on a dyno where they're going to set all the values, and you can see how many values they have to set, which means you have to run the bike at those values. And for me to try to run the bike without a dyno on the street, looking at the different numbers and adjusting the configuration on the fly, it's just not going to happen. Not for me. And so there is an idea that I have that I've read on a board, and it's questionable whether it'll work for as large of 164cc configuration, and that is using something called an FE. I'll describe what it does, but it basically uses the stock ECU. So I take the piggyback Takagawa thing off. It uses the stock ECU and the stock O2 sensor, and it interrupts that signal from the O2 to the ECU and modifies the signal so that instead of targeting stoichiometric for the bike, which is what the ECU generally does, which is 14.7 to 1, instead it'll target between 13 and 13.5. I think it's worth a go. Whether the stock ECU with the large injector is going to be able to handle 164cc, that's yet to be seen. It sounds like a fun thing to try. Not sure if it'll work, but then of course nothing I've done has worked to the level that I'm really looking for. Even with this latest build with the 181cc overly rich configuration, I've got questions of reliability. I've got questions of fuel economy, and am I going to take it on a 1,000-mile adventure without 100% trust in the bike? And I think the answer is no, and I don't think anyone, most people wouldn't take that risk, not without putting, hundreds upon hundreds of miles at high speed to make sure there's absolutely nothing wrong, realizing that if you get the tune wrong at any RPM and any throttle position setting, and you happen to hold it there for any length of time, well, there goes your piston, and if you're in the middle of the bush, I showed that you can, in fact, replace a piston in about 30 minutes, but do you really want to do that? Are you going to carry extra oil? What are you going to do with the oil in the bike that's still there? A number of problems associated with that. So what I'm ultimately looking for is a cheaper solution that allows me the same reliability as the Honda Trail 125 comes stock as, but with the capability of going, the constant 55 miles per hour or over without any concerns. I'm not sure if it's possible, honestly. If you think about the tens of thousands of hours that Honda engineers put into getting everything exactly right, you can tell that they were optimizing toward lower compression ratios, lower RPM maximums, things of that nature, which obviously leads to longevity of engines. But you know, in this particular case, you know, I really need that extra performance for what I need the bike for. And, you know, the question is, well, why didn't you get a bigger bike? Well, I've had bigger bikes. You know, I had the Yamaha TW200, but it wasn't the right bike for me. I mean, it easily could do 55, maybe 60, 65 miles an hour, but it was a lot bigger. It didn't have the clutchless design, or you know, did not have the automatic clutch that the Honda has. And, you know, I used to have a Honda CT110, Honda Trail 110, and that thing was amazing. It'd crawl everywhere. So what am I doing next? And this is a test that I'll be conducting in an upcoming video. So please stay tuned and subscribe. Hit the notification button. And that is, I am going to replace the Yamanashi piston cylinder that's currently in there. We'll take a look at that. I'm planning on throwing in a Kitco 164cc light bore up kit. I'm just switching brands. The prices are about the same. I honestly don't think that this is the problem, but I'm going to rule it out as a possibility. I'm replacing the Takagawa fuel injection controller with an FE from Eagle Research. It's an electronic fuel injection enhancer device, and if you wire it in backwards, it should help richen the fuel mixture. And it should do so automatically since the ECU will be able to adjust. I'm also going to be throwing on a super oil pump kit, and just for the heck of it, a drain bolt with a magnet. Please stay tuned for the next segment where I will be putting in the new parts, removing the Ficon Type E, stripping the bike all the way down. Thank you again for watching. Please subscribe. If you like this video, hit the like button and the notification button. Thank you again, and see you next time.